guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Abiola. In today's tutorial, we will be recreating the corset crop top at the beginning of this video and on the thumbnail. The major materials you would need include 1 yard of crepe or cotton fabric, you would need your zipper, you would need your bias tape, hemming gum and boning. The size of boning I have on the table is about 0.25 inch. Okay, any size of boning you have is fine, but I do think that this size of boning looks very pretty with this top we're about to make. Okay, the next step is to draft out our pattern, and this is going to be a very quick and easy one. The first thing I'm going to do, as always, is to come down by 1 inch from the top of the paper so that I mark out my starting line. I'm just going to mark it multiple times, then connect with my ruler to form a straight line. What we are trying to make is basically a tube top or an off shoulder top. And whenever we are trying to draft our off shoulders, we basically take some inches off the shoulder. That's basically what off the shoulder means. You take some inches off your shoulder, basically. And for this top, you're going to take between 6 to 8 inches, depending on how much cleavage you are willing to show. For me, I decided to take off 7 inches from my measurement or from my shoulder. Like I said earlier, you can decide to use 6, you can decide to use 8. But bear in mind that if you go below 7 inches, you will be showing more cleavage. Okay, so I decided to use 7 inches. I am going to note that 7-inch point and place it on my starting line. Can you see? And from that point, I'm going to go ahead to mark out all my vertical measurement. I'm going to proceed to mark out my bust point, which is 10, my underbust, which is 14, and my waistline, which is 17.5. And as usual, I'm going to mark the point multiple times so that I can get a straight line. So I'll mark my 10, 14, 17.5 about 3 to 4 times, then connect all the points to form a straight line. I'm going to connect the first point into a straight line and label it BP, which means bust point. I would also label where we'll be drafting the front part of the top and the part of the paper where we'll be drafting the back part of the top. I would connect the second point into a straight line and I would label it UB, which means underbust. I would also rule the last one. I would label it WL, which means waist line. The next step is to determine your armhole line, and you can just come down from this top line by 1 inch or 1.5 inches. But for me, I decided to just calculate my accurate armhole line instead of just coming down by either 1 or 1.5 inches. And in order to calculate your accurate armhole line, you're going to divide your bust circumference by 6 plus 1.5 inches. My bust circumference is 39. 39 divided by 6 gives me 6.5 inches. 6.5 plus 1.5 is approximately 8 inches. That means that my armhole line is 8 inches. So I'm going to place that 7 inch on the starting line, then proceed to mark my 8 inches as my armhole line. Okay, that implies that I just came down by 1 inch. That's why I said that you can just come down from the starting line by 1 to 1.5 inches to get your armhole line. Okay, I am going to go ahead to connect the point into a straight line, and I'm going to label this line AHL, which means armhole line. The next step is to divide my bust circumference by 4. 39 divided by 4 gives me 9.75. I'm going to mark that on the armhole line. Okay, so what I just marked is 9.75. Next, I will divide my waist circumference by 4. My waist circumference is 30. 30 divided by 4 gives me 7.5, which I would mark, and I would go ahead to connect the points together with my ruler. The next step is to mark out our dart, and the dart we'll be using depends on the bust size. For a small bust size, which is between 35 inches and below, I'll be using a dart of 1 inch. And for a medium bust size, which is usually between 36 inches to about 44 inches, I'll be using 1.5 inch. And for big bust size, which is usually between 45 inches and above, the dart intake will be 2 inches. Okay, the reason why I use different dart intake for the different bust sizes is because a bigger bust will require more space for the bust to sit in. So if you use the same dart for a small bust for a bigger bust, there will not be enough space for the bust to sit in. Okay, my bust size is 39, which implies that I fall between the medium bust size, so I am going to be using a dart intake of 1.5 inch. So I am going to mark 1.5 inch on the waistline and connect to the armhole line with my meter rule. The next step is to measure what you have on the armhole line. Remember, what we marked on the armhole line was 9.75, and we got that by dividing my bust circumference by 4. My bust circumference is 39. 39 divided by 4 gave us that 9.75. So I'm going to subtract 2 inches from that 9.75. 9.75 minus 2 gives 7.75, which is what I marked on the starting line. I'm going to go ahead to connect the 2 points together using my ruler. After doing that, the next step is to quickly draft out the back part. All we are going to do is just transfer our measurements from the front to the back. The first measurement I'll transfer is the one on my armhole line, which is 9.75. I would mark that. Then also measure what I marked on the waist, which is 7.5. That is without the dart. I would mark that as well and connect the point. Okay, then I would go ahead to add my 1.5 inch dart. Okay, then also connect the point the same way I did for the front. The next step is to measure what I have on my armhole line, which is 9.75, and if you remember, we subtracted 2 inches from that 9.75, which gave me 7.75. That is what I'm going to mark on the starting line, and I will also connect with my ruler. The next step is to mark out our nipple to nipple or bust span divided by 2. My nipple to nipple is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4 inches, which I marked on the waistline. Next, I'll divide my dart intake into 2. My dart intake, remember, it is 1.5. 1.5 divided by 2 is 0.75. You can just go ahead to fold your tape into 2, okay, and mark 0.75 on both sides of the dart. Okay, so I'll mark 0.75 here, 0.75 on the other side. Okay, now I'm also going to go on the underbust and mark my nipple to nipple divided by 2, which is 4. I would also mark the same thing on the bust point line, and I will connect them into a straight line. Next, I'll come down from the bust point by 1 inch, then proceed to connect the points just as shown. Yeah, and this is our dart for the front. Okay, the next step is to determine how long you want your basque to be. I wanted mine to be about 3 inches. You can decide to use 4 or more depending on what you want. So I went ahead to connect from the basque to the side just as shown, and I also extended my dart to touch the basque line. Okay, now there's something you would notice when it comes to basque waistline, especially the dart angle, right? When we cut out our dart, you would notice that the two darts will not align. One area is going to be longer than one. So what I like to do to prevent that is to measure one side of the dart. You can see that it is 8.5 inches. I would also measure the other side of the dart, and you can see that it is 8 inches, which means that I have to add extra 0.5 inches to the other dart leg, then use my meter rule to connect them just as shown. So by the time we try to close our dart, everything is going to align at the basque area. Okay, the next step is to mark out our back dart. At the end of the day, I didn't end up using any dart at the back, but let's just mark it. My nipple to nipple divided by 2 is 4, so I'm going to mark that on my waistline, on my underbust line, and on my bust point line, and I'll connect them into a straight
line. Okay, the length of the back dart is going to be 6 inches, which I'm going to mark, and I will divide my 1.5-inch dart into two. I'll mark 0.75 on one side, 0.75 on the other side, and I will connect the point just as shown. The next step is to get rid of zipper bulge on the waistline. I am going to go in on the waistline by 0.75. 1 inch will also work, okay? I would connect from that point to the top. This is me showing you one of the parts we'll be cutting out. Okay, to totally get rid of zipper bulge, I'm also going to go up from this point by that same 0.75. Okay, you can use 1 inch just like I said, and I'm going to connect from that point to the side seam using my ruler. So I am going to label this pattern the back, and I'll label this the front. The next step is to proceed to cut out just as shown. Okay.
At this point, we've gone ahead to cut out our front and back pattern. So what we're going to do now is to take out our dart from the front pattern and also slash through the underbust area. Okay, if you look at the inspiration on the screen, you can see that there is a division at the underbust area. So I'm going to divide the both of them as A and B, then slash through the underbust area with my scissors. The next step is to pick the B part of the front pattern and cut out the dart. Okay, so I'm going to slash through the dart and use my sellotape to gum the two of them together. If we had not added that extra inches at the other dart leg, the both of them wouldn't have aligned. Okay, so that was the importance of what we did. Now let's focus on the front pattern A. I am going to cut out the dart. Okay, from the inspiration on the screen, you would notice that the top part of this top has a bit of gathers, and in order to get that gathers, we will have to do slash and spread to introduce a bit of gathers to the pattern. So I'm going to divide this topmost part into 1 inch. So I marked 1 inch till the end. Then at the middle area, I also went ahead to mark 1 inch till the end. Then I connected the point with my meter rule. Okay, so after connecting, I went in with my scissors to slash through the lines. Do not slash through to the end of the line, just slash through, but stop about 1 inch before the end. Okay, the next step is to close this dart. Just put the dart together and use your sellotape to hold both of them in place. Okay, note that when you close your dart, your paper is not going to relax well on the table. In order to ensure that it relaxes well, just slash through the top area and stop 1 inch before the end. Okay, you would notice that the paper will relax better on the table this way. Okay, the next step is to bring in a fresh piece of paper and rule out a straight line that will serve as a guideline for our slash and spread. Ensure that the edge of the paper is very straight, I mean where the arrow is pointing. I am going to ensure that the center front of my front pattern aligns with that edge, whilst ensuring that my underbust of my front pattern is exactly on that straight line we drew at first. I'm going to proceed to use my sellotape to hold it in place before I begin to spread. I'm going to spread each of the slash points by 0.5 inch. As I spread each slash point by 0.5 inch, I am going to use my sellotape to hold it down. I am going to spread until I get to the end. Once I am done spreading, I am going to use my sellotape to hold the points that are not sticking to the paper yet, so that by the time I cut it off, it will be easy. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead now to cut it off, but before I finish cutting it off, I'm going to trace out the outline of the topmost part, then proceed to cut it out. Okay, I'm also going to cut out the down parts that we do not need as well, and here's what you have. This is what your slash and spread should look like when you are done. The next step is to proceed to cut out on our fabric. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do now is to fold our fabric into two. Okay, fold your fabric into two first, then fold again.
Okay, the reason why we are folding this way is because we're also using the same fabric to line the top. Okay, the same fabric as the main fabric, the same fabric as the lining. I am going to go ahead to pin my back pattern just as shown. Then I will go ahead to pin the front pattern A, and you know we are cutting the front pattern on fold, so I'm going to place it at the edge and pin it down. Okay, that will help us cut it on fold. Okay, then the front pattern B, I am also going to pin it in a way that I am going to be able to cut it on fold as well. The next step is to add our allowance. I'm going to go to the back pattern at the zipper area and I'm going to mark 1 inch and connect with my ruler. I am also going to mark half inch at the waistline and also connect with my ruler. At this point, I decided that there was no need for a dart at the back and I went ahead to cut off my dart allowance. Okay, you can just go ahead to remove your dart, but if you want to use your dart, it's fine. So I am going to use my scissors to trim off the dart allowance I added. I am going to go ahead to mark out 1 inch as my side seam allowance and I'll connect with my ruler. At the top, I am going to add half an inch and I would also connect with my ruler. At the top of front pattern A, I am going to add half an inch allowance. Okay, at the side, I am going to mark 1 inch at the side and connect. Okay, I would also mark half an inch at the underbust area. Okay, and for front pattern B, I am going to mark half inch at the top. At this point, I didn't know my phone had stopped recording. I marked half an inch at the top, 1 inch at the side, and half an inch at the basque area. Then I went ahead to cut out everything and remove the pins. I am going to start sewing from front pattern A, and what I'm going to do is to create a gathered stitch at the top part of this front pattern A where we will be introducing our gathers. Okay, so I'll head over to my sewing machine now to create that gathered stitch using the loosest stitch on my sewing machine. Note, your gathered stitch should not get to the armhole area as we will not be gathering the armhole side. Here is what I had when I was done sewing my gathered stitch at the topmost part. Okay, I'm going to keep this aside and work on the back pattern. The first thing I will do on the back pattern is to mark out my 1 inch zipper allowance. After marking out my 1 inch zipper allowance, I'm going to go ahead to also mark out my half an inch allowance at the waistline. This is very important when we are fixing our zipper. Okay, so the next thing now is to go ahead to fix my zipper. I am going to ensure that my zipper stops before that half an inch allowance that we marked out. So fix your zipper in a way that it will stop exactly at that half an inch. The next step is to gather this front pattern. Gather it in such a way that it matches with the back pattern, just like I'm showing you. The front pattern is supposed to match with the back pattern, so this is me checking if they match. Okay, and they do. The next step is to turn this front pattern with its lining piece. Okay, so you're going to place the main fabric right side facing up, then place the lining piece right side facing the right sides of the main fabric. Okay, then proceed to pin it down. Okay, after pinning it down, head over to your sewing machine and stitch using 0.5 inch allowance. Here is what I had when I was done stitching. The next step after stitching is to top stitch. It is very important that you top stitch this part. All you have to do is open it up the same way I did. Note the one that is your main fabric and the one that is your lining piece, and push your allowance towards the lining piece. Then proceed to top stitch from the front, just as shown. I know most of you already know how to top stitch. I just decided to explain it for those that do not. Okay,
I made a last minute decision at this point. I decided that I did not want the back to have this straight neckline that it has. I wanted a slightly V neckline at the back, and I decided to go with it since it wasn't too late yet. You can decide to stick with the straight neckline that we have already. You can decide to switch to the V neckline or any neckline of choice. I decided to come down from the zipper area by 2 inches. Okay, and I went ahead to connect it with my meter rule to the armhole area. Then I went ahead to add half an inch allowance for turning the neckline at that point. After which I went ahead to cut it off using my scissors. The next step is to place it back on the lining piece and trim off just as shown. The next step is to create your boning channel using your bias tape, and that depends on the style line you want. For me, I decided to stitch 3 3 on both sides of the zipper. Okay, so I have 1 2 3 here, 1 2 3. You can decide to do 4 4 5 5. Just depends on what you want. So here's what I have when I was done. I went ahead to stitch 1 2 and 3, then I did 1 2 and 3, and I stitched on the wrong side of the fabric. One important tip to note when stitching the sides of your bias tape is to consider the size of your boning. If your boning is 0.5 inch wide, then you can stitch on the edge of your bias tape and it's going to size it perfectly. But for this size of boning that is 0.25, you cannot stitch at the edge because the boning channel will be too wide for the boning and the boning will not stay in one place. Okay, so what you have to do is to stitch the sides of your bias tape in a way that when you put a 0.25 boning, it is going to fit it perfectly. Okay, for the front, I created 5 style lines. Okay, what I did was just to place my bias tape at each point and I stitched the both sides, placed it at the next point, stitched the both sides, placed it here, stitched both sides, and that was it basically. Like I said earlier, ensure to create your boning channel on the wrong side of your fabric. The next step is to turn our front pattern. All you have to do is bring in front pattern A, B, both the main fabric and the lining piece. Okay, fold the lining piece in half and notch the midpoint. Fold the main fabric in half and also notch the midpoint. Then for front pattern A, fold it in half as well and notch the midpoint. The next step is to place front pattern B right side facing up. Okay, as you can see, I turned it. Place front pattern A right side facing up as well. Then pin the right sides together. Then bring in the lining. Okay, and also pin it together. Okay, once you are done pinning the three of them together, proceed to stitch using 0.5 inch allowance. Okay, and here's what I have when I was done stitching. If you have any excess on the side, just trim it off with your scissors. The next step is to turn the back of the top. What I would do is to open up my zipper till the end. Okay, then bring in the lining piece. I'm going to place the lining piece right side facing the right side of the main fabric. I am going to pin it down before I head over to my sewing machine to stitch. I am going to start stitching from the armhole area using 0.5 inch allowance. Then I would make sure to top stitch before I close the zipper area by stitching close to the zipper teeth but not too close. Okay, it is important to use your hemming gum to stitch so that when you flip it to the right side and iron it, everything will lay flat. Okay, at this point guys, I had gone ahead to stitch this part and I made sure to use my hemming gum. So after stitching that part, I'm going to open it up and I am going to make sure that I push my allowance towards the lining piece before I top stitch from the front, stitching the way I'm showing you. So here's a closer view of what my top stitch looks like. Top stitching is very important for this to come out neat. Okay, so after top stitching, I'm going to flip it this way, then close the zipper area. I am going to stitch close to the zipper teeth but not too close. Okay, so that when I flip it to the right side, it is still going to zip perfectly. Okay, after stitching, the next step is to trim off every excess allowance and notch. Very important. Okay, so that when we flip it to the right side, our neckline is going to rest perfectly. The next step is to flip it to the right side. At this point, I wanted to iron, but I decided to iron after I must have passed my boning. Okay, the next step is to cut out our boning and pass it through the boning channel. Okay, in order to cut out your boning, ensure that it is about 0.5 to 1 inch lesser than the original length that you need. Then go ahead to blunt the edge using either your lighter or your masking tape. Okay, the reason why we blunt the edge is so that it doesn't pierce through the fiber, because the edge of a boning can be very sharp. The boning should be about 0.5 to 1 inch lesser than the length you need, because we are going to be turning the down part and you don't want your needle touching boning, plastic boning for that matter. It is going to break your needle, so it's better it is shorter than the original length you need so that you can turn the down part peacefully without any stress. Okay, I am just going to go ahead to use what I cut out for the right side to cut out the left side since they are the same thing. Okay, the next step is to pass the boning through the boning channel.
Okay, so just pass your boning through the boning channel just as shown. Okay, now let's move over to the front. Okay, for the front, I'm going to also carry out the same steps like I did for the back. I'm going to cut out the boning, blunt the edge, and then pass it through the channel. That's it. The next step is to close the down part of the top, flip it over the way you see me doing, and pin the edge. Ensure that the upper part is not in the way, okay, because you don't want to stitch that upper part. What we are doing is just closing the edge. So I'm going to pin it down, head over to my sewing machine and stitch. I'm also going to use my hemming gum to stitch that part so that by the time I flip it over and I iron it, it's going to lay very well. Okay, now over to the back. I'm going to flip it over to the wrong side, okay, and pin as well. Okay, I'll flip the second one to the wrong side as well and pin. Then head over to my sewing machine to stitch with my hemming gum using 1/2 inch allowance. After stitching, I went ahead to trim off every excess allowance, and when I was done with that, I flipped it to the right side. You would also need to flip the front to the right side. This might take you a bit of time, but try your possible best to flip it to the right side. I proceeded to iron it. Do not be bothered if your boning is looking bent or whatnot. Once you iron it, everything is going to straighten out, okay? Once you are done ironing, the next step is to place both the back and the front, right sides facing each other, then pin the sides. Next, you head over to your sewing machine and stitch using 1 inch allowance that we added. And yes, that's the end of this tutorial. When I tried out my own top, I realized that it was a little bit big for me at the bust area, so I went in by holding a bit of allowance on the side, and everything came out perfect after that. So try yours, and if you need to take in more allowance, do that. Okay, we have come to the end of this tutorial. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.